Well, today is Father's Day. And just so you get the right idea about the role of fathers and all this stuff, I have a list of the top 10 things that you will never hear a dad say. Okay? And I start with number 10. Number 10. Well, how about that? I'm lost. Looks like we'll have to stop and ask for directions. Number 9. You know, Pumpkin, now that you're 13, you'll be ready for that unchaperoned car date. Won't that be fun? Number 8. I noticed that all your friends have a certain snarly attitude. I like that. Number 7. Here's a credit card and the keys to my new car. Number 6. What do you mean you want to play football? Figure skating not good enough for you, son? Number 5. Your mother and I are going away for the weekend. You might want to consider throwing a party. Number 4. Well, I don't know what's wrong with your car. Probably one of those doohickey thingies, you know, that makes it run or something. Just have it towed to a mechanic and pay whatever he asks. Number 3. No son of mine is going to live under this roof without an earring. Now, quit your belly aching. Let's go to the mall. Number 2. What do you want to go and get a job for? I make plenty of money for you to spend. And number 1 is Father's Day. Don't worry about that. It's no big deal. I've been kind of involved in this series that I'm doing on using some of the energy out of a purpose-driven life to sort of be the context for my lessons. And it was interesting that this particular section that I'm working with today, excuse me, is the title of is You Were Planned for God's Pleasure. That you were planned for God's pleasure, which is the first purpose that we must understand in a purpose-driven life. And it really fit in, I think, a lot with what the energy of this day is all about in that particular statement, because the idea is that you were created for God, by God. That we were created for God, by God. And the sooner that we get that, the happier our life will be. Now, I have some issues with sort of the traditional context out of which that is often understood. And so my intention today is to sort of take that into a unity sort of perspective and a unity slant. Because oftentimes, when we think about creation and we think that we were created in the image and likeness of God, we tend to think of that in the context of our own parents. So that if we think of God as Father, then when we think of being created in the image and likeness of God, then do we not project onto God many of the attributes and characteristics and traits that we experience in the context of the family in which we were raised, and the dynamics in which we were raised? And so, Father God is really an out-picturing of the relationship in many ways with our own Father when we understand it at that level. Now, in unity, we don't see God in the context of an anthropomorphic being. That we don't think in terms of that structure or that person of God that we think of in terms of our human experience. And so we think God is much, much more than some projection that we make out of our own life experience. That rather, that God is the essence of intelligence, warmth, compassion, love, life, joy, creativity, wholeness, and harmony. That these are all the characteristics and attributes that make up what God really is in terms of the energy. So God is not at all powerful. You know, we think in terms of God as being omnipotent, which is powerful. But the truth is, in the context of our unity understanding of this, is that rather God is omnipotence. That God is the very power that exists. So God is not the manifestation of power. God is the power that is coming forth. God is not omnipresent, Rather, God is omnipresence. God is everywhere presence, within and without and all around. So there is no place that we can point to in the context of our three-dimensional reality where God is other than everywhere. God lives within us, around us. We live and move, as the saying goes, and have our being in God. God is not omniscient, all-knowing. God is omniscience, all knowledge. So all knowledge is the essence of God. And so God is much more than some out-picturing of our human experience. And it's important because when we worship God, we are not moving into a subservient role where we bow down in the human sense. Even though we may bow down in terms of our own willingness to open our hearts up, we don't bow down in the human sense. We acknowledge a presence that is there. We celebrate something. We identify with these qualities, and when we sit in our worship experience and we identify with those qualities of God, we begin to realize that we were created in God's image and likeness. And therefore, those qualities exist in us. That all the qualities of spirit that are seeking to come forth, we have inherited as offspring of our Creator. So think about that for a moment and how that might show up differently. So when we come into our worship service, we come in to awaken us to that reality and to celebrate that understanding. So we are celebrating the presence and the power and the energy of God. Now, so it's hard for me to get into the idea that I'm here to pleasure God in that context, okay? Because I think there's too much human neurosis that's associated with that whole dynamic or that whole mindset. But I can get into the idea that I am here to bring pleasure to my relationship to God and to bring pleasure into the world. Do you see the distinction between the two in terms of the way we think? So what I align with the divine, and then I call it forth, and I elevate that divine energy to its proper place and relationship in my life and in the world and in my interaction with other people. Now, it's important to understand that this awareness, I think, very much is the secret for living a fulfilling life and getting into right relationship with not only our Father God, but with our human Father. Because we're celebrating that energy today. We're celebrating the energy of Father. So, is there anyone here, and this is a rhetorical question, you don't have to raise your hand, is there anyone here who does not recognize the impact that their father has had on their life, even if their dad was not around? Even if their dad was not around. Do you recognize the impact that your father has had on your life? The absence of a father is an impact. So even if he wasn't there, he was there in some way. So even those that have been abused by a father often have a difficult time resonating with the whole idea of Father God, because it's very hard to come out of that hurt and that pain and that energy. And so there's this constant awareness and presence of whatever abuse may have occurred. So what happens is it corrupts the idea in many ways that we are here for God's pleasure. Do you see how hard it is to get into that